He left her without a word, rich and ruthless. 3 years later, in a crowded airport, he locked eyes with a little boy, his own eyes staring back at him. Alex Carter had everything a man could want: wealth, power, intelligence, and charm. At just 32, he was already the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech empires in the country. Magazines called him a genius, investors called him a visionary, and the press labeled him America's most eligible bachelor. But those who knew him personally, the few who got close enough, often used other words: cold, guarded, distant. Love, in Alex's eyes, was a weakness, a distraction. Emotions were liabilities. He had made it this far by relying solely on logic, strategy, and control. And he had no plans to change. Emily Brooks was nothing like the women who usually floated in and out of Alex's carefully compartmentalized life. She was quiet, grounded, a third-year medical student who had grown up in a small town in Oregon. They met at a conference charity dinner, a total accident. She wasn't even supposed to be there, just filling in for a friend who had canceled last minute. Somehow, Alex noticed her among a sea of glamorous, polished guests. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't impressed by him. And that intrigued him. Their relationship wasn't supposed to last. At least not in his mind. He didn't do permanence. But something about Emily's calm presence pulled him in. Her laugh softened him, her questions made him think, and her sincerity disarmed his walls. She challenged him in a way no one else did. Over the course of several months, they began seeing each other more and more. Dinners turned into weekends. Weekends turned into longer stays. And though he never admitted it aloud, part of him began to feel something he didn't understand: comfort. Safety. A strange sense of being known. But then came the day that shattered the illusion. It was raining. She came to his penthouse, soaked from head to toe, eyes red. Her hands trembled as she held onto a folded piece of paper, a printout of her blood work. She didn't have to say anything. He already knew. Her silence was louder than words. "I'm pregnant," she finally whispered, barely audible. Alex froze. He blinked once, then again, as if trying to reboot his mind. The moment stretched unbearably. "How?" was all he said. Not in anger, but in disbelief. "I didn't plan this, Alex. I'm just as scared as you are." He stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the skyline. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The rain tapped against the glass like a ticking clock. "I can't do this," he said, his voice low and cold. "I told you from the start, I don't want a family." "You don't have to be involved," Emily said quickly, trying to hold herself together. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought. I thought you deserved to know." "That was your mistake," he said sharply. Then, after a long pause, he added, "You should go." She looked at him, eyes full of disbelief. But he didn't turn around. He didn't look at her once as she picked up her coat and left, tears mixing with the rain on her face. The next morning, when she woke up in her tiny apartment, there was no message from him. No apology. Just a silent wire transfer to her bank account, a large sum, cold and impersonal. No subject line. No note. No name. Emily stared at the numbers on her screen and felt her stomach turn. It wasn't help. It was hush money. The final word from a man who had already moved on. She closed the laptop and pressed her hand to her belly. There was no one else now. It would be her and the child. That was all. And in a cold, glass-walled office high above the city, Alex Carter went back to his spreadsheets and board meetings, erasing her from his mind like a deleted file. Emily left the city 2 weeks after the night that changed everything. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even her closest friends. There was nothing left for her in that place, no memories she wanted to keep, no ties she wanted to maintain. The once thrilling skyline that used to take her breath away now only made her feel small, like a forgotten shadow passing through someone else's story. She packed her few belongings in silence, not even crying anymore. The pain had settled into something quieter now, something deeper. It lived in her bones. She found a small apartment in a quiet town in Northern California. It was nothing like the life she once had. The walls were thin, the heater barely worked, and the shower sometimes sputtered to a stop in the middle of washing. But the rent was low and the neighborhood was safe, and those were the only 2 things that mattered now. She enrolled in evening classes to try and keep up with her medical training and took 2 part-time jobs, one waitressing at a local diner and another working the night shift at a pharmacy. Sleep became a luxury. She moved through the days with mechanical determination, driven by the growing life inside her. The pregnancy was hard. There were days when she felt like her body wasn't hers anymore, like it belonged to some other version of herself that she hadn't yet met. Morning sickness was cruel, and exhaustion was constant. She didn't have anyone to lean on, not really. There were moments, alone on her small mattress, listening to the sounds of her neighbors through the walls, when the loneliness felt unbearable, like a heavy, invisible hand pressing down on her chest. But even on the worst days, she never doubted her choice. Not once. When she first saw the baby on the ultrasound screen, something inside her shifted, not in fear, but in awe. That tiny flutter, that heartbeat like a whisper, it was real. He was real. Her son. Her reason to keep going. She gave birth on a cold evening in early March. No one was there to hold her hand, no one waiting in the hallway. She bit her lip through the contractions, breathing through the pain as nurses moved around her with professional detachment. When the baby finally arrived, screaming and red-faced and beautiful, she held him to her chest and wept harder than she had in years. Not out of sorrow, but from the overwhelming flood of something she hadn't felt in a long time, love, fierce and unconditional. She named him Lucas. The name had come to her weeks earlier, while walking home from work beneath a sky filled with stars. She had whispered it into the cold air, unsure if he could hear her yet, but certain it would be his. Lucas Brooks. A new life, a clean slate. Her son. Lucas had dark, thick hair from the moment he was born. But what took her breath away were his eyes, bright, impossible blue. So blue it was almost painful to look at them. Eyes that didn't belong to her. Eyes she had tried to forget. The first time he looked up at her with those eyes, she felt something split inside her, a mixture of grief and wonder. He didn't ask to be born with those eyes, and she didn't ask to be reminded every day of the man who gave them to him. But there it was, truth written into his DNA. Emily learned quickly how to live with less. Baby clothes from thrift stores. Free clinics instead of private doctors. She learned to swaddle a crying child with one hand while flipping pancakes with the other. She studied while he napped in her lap and took exams running on 3 hours of sleep. Every dollar mattered. Every hour was accounted for. Sometimes she would stare at Lucas while he slept, his eyelashes brushing his cheeks, and wonder how something so perfect had come from something so broken. The town grew familiar. People at the diner began to know her name. An elderly couple 2 floors up offered to watch Lucas when her shifts overlapped. She never told anyone about her past. Not about the man who had walked away. Not about the penthouse, or the money, or the silence that followed. That part of her story didn't belong here. She had buried it deep and built a new world on top of it, fragile, maybe, but hers. As Lucas began to crawl, then walk, then speak his first words, Emily found pieces of joy again. Not the loud, overwhelming kind. Softer joy, in the way he said "Mama" in the middle of the night, or in the way he clapped every time he saw a dog, or in the way he laughed when they danced to music in the kitchen. He was growing fast, with a wild curiosity and a smile that could melt even her hardest days. He was the light that got her out of bed every morning, the anchor that kept her grounded when she wanted to give up. And yet, there were moments when she caught herself staring at him just a second too long. Moments when she saw not just her son, but a reflection of someone else, a man she had once loved, or thought she loved. A man who had never even seen the face of his child. She wondered sometimes what he would think if he saw Lucas. If he would recognize himself. If he would care. But those were dangerous thoughts, thoughts that opened wounds she had worked too hard to close. So she pushed them away and kissed her son's forehead and reminded herself, this life, this boy, this journey, it was hers now. And hers alone. The airport was crowded that morning, buzzing with the kind of barely controlled chaos only a Monday could bring. People hurried in every direction, dragging suitcases, cradling coffee cups, checking phones like lifelines. Alex Carter moved through it all like a ghost in a tailored suit, purposeful and disconnected, as if none of it truly touched him. He had flown more miles in the past year than he could count, and airports had long since lost any sense of novelty or meaning. They were simply hallways between deals, waiting rooms between boardrooms. Today was no different. His flight to London was delayed by 40 minutes, and he had already paced the private lounge twice before deciding to step outside into the general concourse in search of better coffee. He wasn't in a good mood. The meeting in London was critical, and he hated delays. He hated anything that disrupted the tightly wound structure of his days. That structure kept everything in control, kept thoughts buried, kept his mind on work. Disruption meant reflection, and he had no time for that. He stood in line at a cafe near gate 27, eyes on his phone, half listening to the man ahead of him argue with a barista about oat milk. The hum of conversations blended into a single, steady noise, white noise that Alex had learned to ignore. But then something cut through. A laugh. Not loud or shrill, but bright, unmistakably childlike. For a reason he couldn't explain, it made his eyes lift from the phone. At a table by the window sat a young boy, maybe 3 years old, perched in one of the high stools with a juice box in front of him. His feet dangled freely, too short to reach the floor. He was laughing at something, something simple, something innocent, maybe the way his juice straw bubbled. His hair was dark and unruly, flopping slightly over his forehead. But what stopped Alex cold, what knocked the breath clean out of his lungs, were the boy's eyes. They were blue. Not just blue. His blue. That particular, piercing, ice-clear shade that had made strangers comment since he was a teenager. That shade that no one in his family shared. That had always set him apart. He stared, unable to move, as the boy looked toward the window and the morning light caught the color in full. It was like looking into a mirror shrunk by time. He didn't hear the barista calling out the next order. He didn't realize he had stepped out of line. His phone dimmed in his hand, forgotten. He kept staring. And then she appeared. A woman walked up to the child with a napkin in hand, gently wiping a drop of juice from his chin. She leaned in and whispered something, and the boy giggled again. She was turned slightly, profile only, but even after all this time, after everything, he recognized her. Emily. His heart began to pound, and not in any way he liked. It wasn't anticipation. It was panic. Guilt. Disbelief. She looked different. Her hair was longer now, darker, pulled back loosely. She wore no makeup, simple jeans, an oversized sweater. There was something about her posture, tired, but sturdy, that told him she had become someone entirely new. And yet, beneath it all, she was still her. The girl he had once held. The girl he had left. He couldn't move. His feet were locked to the ground, his body frozen in a strange, trembling silence. The boy was hers. Of course he was. And if the boy had those eyes, his eyes, then that meant only one thing. He had a son. For a few seconds, all the noise around him disappeared. It was just them. Just that image, mother and child, like a frame torn out of someone else's life. A life he had walked away from without knowing what he was losing. Emily turned then. She must have felt his stare, that strange sensation of being watched. Her eyes found him. For a moment, neither of them reacted. Her expression didn't change. She didn't gasp or cry out. She didn't drop the juice box or stumble in shock. She simply looked at him, her face unreadable. But her body went still. Her fingers tightened just slightly on the boy's shoulder. Alex finally stepped forward, slowly, like approaching a cliff's edge. "Emily," he said, his voice dry and lower than he meant it to be. It didn't feel real, hearing her name aloud after so long. She straightened. "What are you doing here?" Her tone was calm but sharp, like a door half open with a chain still locked. He glanced at the boy, then back at her. "I was getting coffee. My flight's delayed." Her eyes narrowed. "Of course it is." He hesitated. "Is he yours?" She looked down at the child, who was now distracted by a small toy truck in his hand. "He's mine," she said, her voice soft but firm. Alex swallowed. "He has my eyes." She didn't respond right away. Then, finally, she met his gaze again and said, "Yes. And he cries with mine." The words hit harder than a slap. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling for something to say. "Anything." "I didn't know," he managed. "You didn't want to know." Her voice cracked just slightly, the only betrayal of her emotion. "And now you do. So what?" He looked at her, really looked. She was stronger than he remembered. Not colder, but sharper, forged by something he couldn't begin to understand. She had become a woman who had walked through fire and kept walking. He paused, lost. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." "Well," she said, reaching down to pick up her bag, "now you have." He watched as she took the boy's hand, his son's hand, and turned to walk away. The child didn't even glance back. But Alex stood there, rooted in place, his heart hollowed by the weight of realization. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at numbers or charts or contracts. He wasn't looking at a future of success or legacy. He was looking at everything he had turned his back on. And it had eyes just like his. Alex didn't sleep that night. He sat in the darkened corner of his penthouse, city lights flickering through the tall windows like distant reminders of a world he no longer felt part of. The airport encounter replayed in his mind over and over with the clarity of a nightmare that refused to fade. He kept seeing the boy's face, those impossible, undeniable blue eyes, staring out the window, unaware that the man who had given him half his existence stood just steps away. And then there was Emily, so much older in her silence, so much stronger in her stillness, carrying the weight of something he had never been asked to carry. He kept hearing her words, especially the last ones. He has your eyes. And he cries with mine. That sentence looped in his chest like a hook dragging across open skin. Alex had always believed that the past could be outrun if he moved fast enough, worked hard enough, stayed far enough ahead. He had convinced himself that some choices simply disappeared over time, that if you left something behind early enough, it wouldn't follow you. But he had been wrong. He hadn't just abandoned a woman. He had abandoned a life. A life that had continued to grow without him. A life that had learned to walk, to speak, to laugh. A life with his eyes and someone else's bedtime stories. The next morning, after a night without rest, Alex cancelled his flight to London. He didn't care about the meetings or the furious emails his assistant sent after he missed his boarding time. For the first time in years, business felt distant, irrelevant. What had always been his purpose now felt like a cover, like a beautifully polished shell hiding something hollow. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do, but he knew he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen them. Not anymore. He spent the following days trying to find her. She had vanished again, no phone number, no address, nothing left from their old life that could lead him to her. He called people he hadn't spoken to in years, followed dead ends, tracked through public records with no luck. Every trail went cold. It was as if she had erased herself completely after the day she walked out of his apartment with tears in her eyes and a hand on her stomach. And maybe she had. Maybe she'd known even then that he wouldn't follow. That he wasn't the kind of man who chased what mattered. But now, everything had changed. It was by pure chance, fate, maybe, that he saw her again. For days after the airport, he had gone to a small bookstore in the city, desperate for any distraction. He was standing near the children's section, mindlessly flipping through a book he wasn't really reading, when he heard a small, familiar laugh. A laugh he'd only heard once before. He turned slowly. Emily stood a few feet away, crouched beside a shelf, helping the boy, Lucas, reach for a picture book. Her hair was pulled up in a messy bun, and she wore a faded sweatshirt with a tear near the sleeve, but she looked beautiful in a way that made his throat tighten. The boy was animated, waving a book about dinosaurs in the air, and she was laughing softly, gently teasing him. It was so domestic, so natural, so whole. And none of it included him. He stepped forward, uncertain, afraid. Emily turned. The moment she saw him, her face fell, not with fear, but with exhaustion, as though she had been bracing for this exact moment and had hoped it wouldn't come. "We need to talk," Alex said quietly, his voice breaking the fragile peace between them. She looked down at Lucas, then back at Alex. "Not here." There was a small coffee shop next to the bookstore. They sat outside, the wind tugging at napkins and cooling the air between them. Lucas stayed inside with a friendly cashier, happily occupied with a muffin and crayons. Emily sipped her coffee slowly, avoiding his eyes. "I'm not here to take anything," Alex said, unsure of what else to say. I didn't know." "You knew enough to walk away," she replied without looking at him. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't grow up with a family that made me believe I could be anything other than what I am. My father was," he stopped, shaking his head. "He was cruel. And I thought the best thing I could do was leave before I ruined you. Before I ruined him." Emily looked at him finally. Her eyes were tired, lined with years of missed sleep and single motherhood, but they were clear. "And yet, leaving didn't save us from the ruin. I went through everything alone. Doctor's visits. Labor. Sleepless nights. Fevers. Panic. Joy. First steps. First words. All of it. Alone. Alex nodded. I know. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't expect it. But I want to understand him. To be part of his life in some way. If you'll let me. Emily's hands tightened around her cup. Do you know what he asked me last week? He saw another boy with his dad at the park and asked me why he didn't have one. Do you know how many times I've had to lie, or change the subject, or tell him I was enough? He opened his mouth but couldn't speak. She continued. And now, suddenly, you're here. And you think that what? You can show up and fix things with coffee and good intentions? That's not how this works. He's not an idea, Alex. He's a person. A small person with a heart that bruises easily. I don't want to hurt him, he said, his voice low. I just want to know him. They sat in silence for a long while. People passed by on the street, completely unaware of the quiet war unraveling between two people and all the words that had gone unsaid for too long. Finally, Emily spoke. He doesn't know who you are. To him, you're just a stranger. If I let you near him, and then you disappear again, it'll destroy him. So if you're serious, if you really want to be part of his life, it's not something you can walk into lightly. Alex looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded. I'm not walking away again. She studied him for a moment longer, and something in her eyes, something heavy, shifted. Not forgiveness. Not trust. But maybe the very first grain of something new. A chance. You can see him, she said softly. But only as a friend. At first. And only if you mean it. He nodded again, almost afraid to breathe. She stood and walked toward the window of the bookstore. Inside, Lucas waved excitedly through the glass, holding up a picture he had drawn. Alex turned and followed her gaze. And for the first time, he saw not just the past or the guilt or the regret, but the future. And in that moment, something cracked open in his chest. Something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. Not redemption. Not yet. But the start of a road that might lead there. In the weeks that followed, Alex entered a world he had never imagined for himself, a world of storybooks and sticky fingers, mismatched socks and unpredictable nap schedules. It was a place where time slowed down, where hours were measured not in deadlines or market trends but in juice spills, laughter, and the thousand small questions of a curious child. Emily kept her word but held her boundaries firm. She allowed him to visit Lucas at the park on Saturdays, sometimes at the library during reading hour, always in public, always supervised. She never introduced him as Lucas's father. At first, she simply said, "This is my friend, Alex." And Alex, who had once negotiated billion-dollar contracts without flinching, felt his throat close every time he heard it. He learned to approach gently, slowly, with patience he didn't know he had. Lucas was shy at first, more interested in building castles in the sandbox than talking to the man who stood just outside his bubble. But Alex came every time. Rain or shine. On time. No excuses. And slowly, something changed. Lucas started handing him plastic shovels. He began asking Alex to read books aloud. One day, without thinking, he reached for Alex's hand while crossing the street. Alex gripped it like it was made of glass, afraid that letting go might shatter something precious. Emily watched all of it with careful, guarded eyes. She didn't interfere, but she didn't relax either. She was always present, always attentive. Trust, for her, was not something that could be rebuilt with gestures. It had to be earned with consistency. She had spent 3 years protecting her son from absence, from disappointment, from the kind of abandonment that carved itself into children and never quite healed. She wasn't going to risk him again, not even if part of her wanted to believe that Alex had truly changed. Alex tried, in his own quiet way, to prove that he had. He wrote her a letter, not an email, not a text, but a handwritten letter on thick paper, the kind that left a weight when held. It wasn't long, but it was honest. He wrote about the day she told him she was pregnant, about the panic that had consumed him, how he had felt like the walls were closing in. He told her how his own father had been nothing more than a shadow, a voice behind a slammed door, a source of fear instead of love. He confessed that he had thought walking away would protect her, protect the child, keep them from whatever damage he might cause. But in doing so, he had caused the very pain he feared. He wrote that he had spent years convincing himself he had done the right thing, but seeing Lucas had destroyed that illusion in seconds. He admitted that the success he had built meant nothing in the face of what he had lost, and that every day since the airport he had been haunted not just by regret but by an overwhelming desire to do better, to be better, not for himself, but for the boy with his eyes and her heart. He left the letter in her mailbox, unsigned, because he knew she would recognize his handwriting. She never mentioned the letter aloud, but something in her demeanor shifted after that. She began inviting him to more outings, a trip to the aquarium, an afternoon at the zoo. Still public, still structured, but there was less tension in the air. Sometimes they even laughed together, reminiscing about old memories that felt like they belonged to different people. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was no longer ice. Lucas, oblivious to the layers of history between them, simply adapted. Children don't measure time the way adults do. He didn't remember being abandoned, because he had never known there was someone to miss. All he knew was that a kind man named Alex kept showing up with silly voices for book characters and an endless willingness to answer his endless stream of questions. He knew that Alex listened, really listened, when he talked about dinosaurs or thunderstorms or why the moon followed the car at night. He knew that when he fell and scraped his knee at the playground, Alex picked him up before Emily could even get there. And he knew that when he hugged Alex, it felt safe. One afternoon, while they sat on a park bench watching ducks gather near the water, Lucas climbed into Alex's lap without a word. It wasn't planned or prompted. It just happened, as natural as breathing. Alex froze for a moment, then wrapped his arms around the small boy and held him tighter than he thought he dared. Emily, sitting a few feet away, didn't interrupt. She just watched, her expression unreadable, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Later that evening, Alex walked them home, as he sometimes did now. When they reached her apartment, Lucas was fast asleep in her arms. Alex looked at her, not with expectation, but with something quieter, hope without pressure. She hesitated, then nodded toward the door. He followed her inside. She laid Lucas gently on the couch, covering him with a blanket. They stood in the kitchen, the silence thick with words unsaid. "I read your letter," she said finally. He nodded. "I meant every word." "I know," she replied. She looked at him, truly looked, as if seeing him not as the man she once loved or hated, but as the man he might now be. "You've changed." He didn't respond right away. Then, softly, he said, "I'm trying. I don't expect anything from you, Emily. I don't want to rewrite the past. I just want to be part of his future." She looked down at her hands. Then back at him. "We'll take it one step at a time." He felt something loosen in his chest, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. When he left that night, she didn't close the door immediately. She stood there for a moment, watching him walk down the hallway, her fingers resting lightly on the doorframe. And though the space between them was still wide, it no longer felt impossible. Something had begun. Not a clean slate, not a sudden reunion. But something fragile and real. A first step toward healing. And for Alex, that was more than he had ever dared to ask. The first time Alex saw Emily truly angry, not cold, not guarded, but openly furious, was a few days after a rainy afternoon when Lucas had come down with a high fever. It had been unexpected. One moment he was giggling on the swings at the park, rosy-cheeked and full of energy, and the next he was shivering in the back seat, his head drooping to one side, his breath warm and uneven. Emily had handled it with the calm of someone who had done it before, fever medicine from the cabinet, a cool cloth on his forehead, a quiet lullaby hummed as she lay beside him through the night. Alex had been there too, watching helplessly from a chair in the corner, unsure of where his hands should be or what he was allowed to do. He had offered to help, and she had nodded politely, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the practiced independence of someone who no longer expected help from anyone, especially not from him. The next morning, Lucas was better. Sleepy but smiling, his temperature down and appetite returning. Emily looked worn down but relieved. Still, when Alex offered to take Lucas for a few hours that weekend, to give her time to rest, she hesitated. "Why now?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "Why are you here now, after everything?" It wasn't the first time she had asked him a difficult question, but this one felt different. It wasn't rhetorical. She truly wanted to understand. She wasn't trying to trap him or punish him, she was trying to protect herself from making the mistake of trusting him again. He swallowed hard, knowing that any shallow answer would only deepen the damage. He sat down across from her, at the edge of the couch, and for a moment he didn't speak. Then he said, "Because I was a coward. Because I thought leaving was doing you a favor. Because I didn't know how to stay. And because I hated the idea of becoming my father more than I wanted to become yours." Emily looked at him carefully. Her silence was not indifference, it was a test. An open space where lies would echo and truth would tremble. Alex continued, slowly, deliberately. "I grew up with a man who believed fear was the only kind of control. I was never hugged, never told, 'I love you.' I was told to perform, to compete, to win. And when I didn't, he made me feel like I didn't exist. I promised myself I'd never be like him. I thought walking away would break the cycle. But I see now I just created a new one. I didn't hit him. I didn't scream. I simply disappeared. And that kind of absence leaves scars too." Emily's expression softened, but only slightly. "You had a choice, Alex." "I didn't." "I know," he whispered. "And I will carry that forever." She finally looked away, toward the hallway where Lucas's toys were scattered on the floor, small dinosaurs lined up in military formation, crayon drawings pinned crookedly to the wall. There was a life here. A real one. And for years, she had been the architect of every inch of it. "You don't know how hard it was," she said. "To bring him home alone from the hospital, still bleeding, still aching, and know that there was no one to call. No one waiting. I cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear. I lied to him about why he didn't have a dad. I swallowed my pride every time I saw a father holding his child in the park and reminded myself that my son deserved joy, not bitterness." Alex felt like the floor beneath him had tilted. He had imagined the pain he caused in vague terms, but now it had shape, detail, weight. He wanted to say something, but nothing would be enough. She kept speaking, her voice calm but layered with years of exhaustion. "And then one day, out of nowhere, you're in the airport. And suddenly the boy I raised alone has a man with his eyes staring at him like he's a revelation. Do you have any idea how surreal that was? How cruel it felt? I don't, he admitted. But I want to. I want to understand what I've missed. I want to know the things that hurt. I won't ever make excuses again. I'm not here to erase what happened. I just want to earn whatever pieces you'll allow me to have now. Emily looked at him for a long moment, the air between them filled with all the years they had lived separately. Then she asked the question that had lived in her heart the longest. Do you love him? Alex didn't hesitate. More than anything. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. And I'm still learning how to show it the right way. But I'm here. I'm not leaving again. Her breath caught slightly at his words. She nodded slowly, as if giving herself permission to believe them. After that conversation, something shifted between them. Emily was still cautious, still guarded. But she allowed him more space. She let him help with small routines, brushing Lucas's teeth, packing his school bag, reading bedtime stories. Lucas began asking if Alex could come to his birthday. If Alex could take him to the zoo. If Alex could stay for just 5 more minutes. Emily didn't correct him. She didn't call him Dad, but she also didn't say no. One evening, as they sat on the couch folding laundry, Lucas asleep in the next room, Emily turned to Alex and said quietly, "You've become part of his life." I didn't think I'd ever say that. I still don't know what it means exactly. But he smiles differently when you're around. It's not that he was unhappy before, he just seems more whole. Alex swallowed the emotion rising in his throat. He didn't want to cry. Not here. Not now. But her words touched something raw in him. I don't deserve either of you, he said. But I want to keep deserving you anyway. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the quiet breaths of a sleeping child in the next room. And though the past still lingered like a shadow, and the wounds between them were far from fully healed, the space they sat in was no longer filled with silence and blame. It was filled with the weight of hard-won truth, and the fragile, flickering light of something that neither of them dared name, hope. By the time autumn arrived, the leaves turning golden and the air carrying the first whispers of the coming cold, something unspoken had changed in the rhythm of their lives. It wasn't sudden, nor was it dramatic. There were no declarations or lines crossed with loud intention. It was quieter than that. Like the way a shadow stretches across a wall as the sun slowly sets, the presence of Alex in Lucas's life had gone from occasional to expected, from tolerated to welcomed, and, eventually, something very close to essential. Lucas, who had once clung tightly to Emily's hand whenever a stranger approached, now ran ahead of them at the park, always checking to see if Alex was following. He would turn around mid-sprint, his blue eyes lighting up when he saw that yes, Alex was still there, still smiling, still reaching out with open arms. He had become someone Lucas looked for in crowds, someone he asked about at breakfast, someone whose absence drew a frown and whose voice on the phone brought instant joy. When Emily tucked him into bed at night, sometimes he whispered, "Can Alex come tomorrow?" and she found herself saying yes more often than not. Emily noticed all the small changes too. The way Lucas spoke differently around Alex, with a certain confidence she hadn't seen before. The way he seemed to carry himself taller, prouder, as though having Alex in his life answered a question he hadn't known he was asking. And then there were the things that Alex himself did, the way he showed up not just when it was convenient, but when it was hard. He sat through parent-teacher meetings with quiet humility. He helped Lucas practice writing his name, patiently guiding his tiny fingers even when the boy grew frustrated and scribbled all over the paper. He didn't boast or pretend to have all the answers. He simply stayed. And yet, despite all this, Emily still carried her caution like armor. She had given too much once, too easily, and paid for it with silence and abandonment. She didn't want to repeat that mistake. But even armor wears down under warmth, and slowly, imperceptibly, she began to soften. It started with small things: an invitation to stay for dinner, a shared laugh over Lucas's impossible logic, the way her hand brushed his and didn't pull away as quickly as it once had. It wasn't trust yet, but it was something like belief, the seed of possibility pushing through the cracks in the soil. One evening in late October, they took Lucas to a local fall festival. The streets were lined with glowing jack-o'-lanterns, booths selling apple cider and caramel corn, and children running in costumes that made them trip over their own feet. Lucas was dressed as a tiny astronaut, his helmet slightly too big and constantly slipping down over his eyes. Alex had picked out the costume weeks earlier, remembering a conversation about rockets that Lucas had started and never quite finished. When they arrived at the festival, Lucas took both of their hands and pulled them forward with the urgent energy only children possess, insisting they try every game, every ride, every booth. As the evening wore on, Emily watched Alex with growing awareness. He wasn't just playing a role. He wasn't showing up because of guilt or pressure or obligation. He was fully present, laughing when Lucas laughed, bending down to tie his shoelaces, letting the boy climb onto his shoulders without hesitation. There was no pride in it, no performance, just love. Real, simple, powerful love. And that, more than anything, scared her. Because it meant this might actually be real. And real things could break. Later that night, after Lucas had fallen asleep in the back seat of the car, his sticky fingers still clutching a bag of candy, Emily and Alex stood outside her apartment in the cool night air. She hesitated before speaking, her breath forming clouds between them. "He called you Daddy tonight," she said softly, not looking at him. Alex's eyes widened. "I heard it," he whispered. "I wasn't sure if I imagined it." "You didn't," she said. "He's been asking questions. About where you live. If you had a mommy and daddy. If you'll always be around." "And what do you say?" he asked gently. "I tell him the truth. That you care about him. That you're learning. That we're figuring things out. But he's a kid. He hears what he wants to hear." "I don't want to disappoint him," Alex said. "Or you." "I know," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. "That's why this scares me." He stepped closer, not invading, just near enough that she could feel the warmth of his sincerity. "I'm scared too. Every day. But not of being here. I'm scared of doing it wrong. Of not knowing how to fix what I broke. Of not being enough for him." "You already are," she said, surprising herself with the words. "Maybe not perfect. Maybe not yet. But you're more than he ever had. More than I thought he would ever have." They stood in silence for a long moment, the street lamp above casting a golden glow that made the moment feel suspended in time. Alex reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small keychain. It was shaped like a rocket ship, silver and simple, with a tiny engraving that read, "To the moon and back." "I saw it at the festival," he said. "I was going to give it to him, but I think I want you to hold on to it. For now." Emily took the keychain and held it between her fingers, feeling the metal warm against her skin. It was such a small thing, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that builds over time, with presence, with effort, with love. When Alex turned to go, she didn't stop him. But she didn't close the door right away either. She stood there for a while, the keychain still in her hand, thinking about everything they had been through to arrive at this strange, uncertain place. There was still so much they didn't know. So much pain that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. But for the first time, she let herself imagine what it might look like, someday, to have him truly stay. And inside, Lucas slept with the easy, open trust of a child who felt safe. The day of Lucas's 4th birthday arrived with the golden light of early spring warming the sidewalks and brightening the curtains of Emily's apartment. The air was crisp but carried a promise of renewal, that gentle in-between season where winter has softened its grip and everything starts to bloom again. Emily had stayed up late the night before, hanging decorations and icing cupcakes while Lucas slept peacefully in the next room. There was a quiet, unspoken hope in her chest, one she didn't quite know what to do with. This birthday felt different, not just because Lucas was a year older, but because for the first time, she wasn't the only one planning it. Alex had offered to help, and not in a passive, distant way, but actively and wholeheartedly. He had shown up with arms full of supplies, balloons trailing behind him, a dinosaur-themed gift wrapped in paper Lucas would later rip apart with wild joy. He had even baked a cake, slightly lopsided and unevenly frosted, but made with such honest effort that Emily couldn't help but smile when she saw it. He was nervous about it, worried Lucas would notice the imperfections, but when the boy saw it that morning, his eyes lit up as though it had been made by magic. "You made this?" he asked, and Alex nodded shyly. Lucas clapped his hands and declared it the best cake in the whole world, and Alex nearly cried. Guests arrived slowly, a few neighborhood kids from the preschool, the elderly couple from upstairs who had become like grandparents, and a few parents Emily had grown close to through playground chats and shared cups of coffee during school pickup. The living room was filled with laughter, the clatter of tiny feet, and the chaos of party games. There was something deeply touching about watching Lucas beam with happiness, surrounded by people who cared, no longer sheltered in the tight, lonely circle Emily had kept around them for so long. Throughout the party, Alex remained close but never overbearing. He helped organize games, tied party hats, handed out juice boxes, and kept an eye on the children with surprising ease. Whenever Lucas looked for him, he was there. And Emily, watching it all from the kitchen, arms crossed and heart cautiously full, began to feel the last layers of doubt start to peel away. Not because everything was perfect, not because the past had been erased, but because what she saw in front of her was real. Later, after the guests had left and the apartment had quieted, they all sat together on the floor surrounded by torn wrapping paper and half-eaten cupcakes. Lucas curled up between them, the energy of the day finally giving way to sleepiness. He laid his head in Emily's lap, one arm reaching out to hold onto Alex's hand. It was such a simple gesture, so instinctive, and yet it sent a shiver down Alex's spine. He looked at Emily, his throat tightening. "I've never had a day like this," he said quietly. "Not as a kid. Not as an adult. Just this. Joy. Family. I didn't know what it felt like until today." Emily ran her fingers gently through Lucas's hair. "You helped make this day," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "He was happy because you were part of it." Alex hesitated, then said, "There's something I've wanted to say. Something I've been waiting for the right moment to ask." She looked at him, wary but open. "I know I have no right to expect anything," he began. "I know I failed you. I know I wasn't there when it mattered most. But I'm here now, and I want to keep being here. Not just for Lucas. For you, too. I love him. I love both of you. And I want a life with you, not just visits and park days. I want real mornings, with burnt toast and missed buses and laughter and arguments and everything in between. I want to stand beside you, not in the shadow of the man I was, but as the man I'm still becoming." Emily didn't respond right away. Her eyes were glossy, her expression unreadable. She looked down at Lucas, who was now asleep, his breathing even and peaceful, one hand still wrapped tightly around Alex's. She reached into the nearby drawer and pulled out something small, a silver keychain in the shape of a rocket ship. The one Alex had given her months ago at the fall festival. She had kept it, all this time, tucked away but never forgotten. She held it out to him. "He still asks about the moon sometimes," she said. "He tells me he's going to go there one day and bring us with him. I think you planted that idea." "I hope I did," Alex whispered. Emily placed the keychain in his hand. "I believe you, Alex. I do. Not because you said the right words. Because you showed up. Over and over, even when I pushed you away. Even when you were afraid. You earned this moment." She leaned in slowly and kissed him, not desperate, not hesitant, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had waited a long time to feel safe again. It was a kiss that tasted like forgiveness, like beginnings, like trust rediscovered through months of small, consistent truth. When she pulled away, she looked into his eyes and said, "Let's go to the moon and back. Together." And in that moment, Alex realized he had finally found the thing he had been searching for his entire life, not power, not money, not control. But this. A hand in his, a child asleep between them, a woman beside him who had every reason to walk away, and instead chose to believe. A family. And it all began with a pair of eyes he once saw in an airport, eyes that had matched his own, but belonged to someone much better than he had ever been. Someone who had taught him what love truly looked like, not with words, but with presence. From that day forward, he never left again.